Well, the clock is winding down. The election is just 2 days away, and several issues have dominated this race. But how has this campaign played out when it comes to matters of race? For more on this, we've invited Anita Li onto the program. She's a media consultant and professor based right here in Toronto. Hello, Anita.
Hi, Aarti.
All right, so let's start with how we believe race has sort of come up within this campaign and what attitudes we have seen sort of surface in Canada during the course of this election campaign.
So what's interesting is what the brownface and blackface incident showed us is that we actually, as a country, don't really talk about race very much. And when we do talk about it, it's not necessarily in the most nuanced or productive way. And for example, a lot of the racial discussions that come up during the campaign usually revolve around immigration. But immigration isn't an issue inherent or exclusive to racialized communities. Obviously, there are immigrants who are people of color and who aren't. There are Canadian-born citizens who are people of color and who aren't. And I think the tendency for us as a country to do this, and the reason why we just don't talk about race in such nuanced ways, is because multiculturalism is entrenched in our Constitution. Canada has a tendency, because of our global reputation for pluralism and diversity, to rest on our laurels. So in some ways, we treat the issue of race as if we've already solved it. And that's
as if it's non-existent in this country.
Exactly, as if it's non-existent, and that's obviously not true.
Now, you raised the issue of blackface, which of course was one of the major issues involving race that has been talked about during the course of this election campaign, and you actually spoke to CBC News about it at the time.
Yes.
Do you think that that has played into voters' decisions on whether or not they want to support a Liberal government this time around?
So, I mean, you can just take a look at the polling data and you see that it definitely has impacted voters' decisions. And anecdotally, I've also noticed this in my own circles as well. But the thing is, I don't want to be reductive about this because I think it's so much more than just the issue of brownface and blackface. I think it's oftentimes when people are critical, were critical of the Liberals and Trudeau, it was because they felt like there was a disconnect between the way our Prime Minister and our country presents itself versus what we actually do in the country. So there's a disconnect between the talk that we talk and the fact that we don't necessarily walk the walk, essentially. But the thing is, I've also heard a lot of people speak about forgiveness and the importance of just as acknowledging if people are willing to put in the work, or if they're genuinely remorseful, if they're willing to learn. So I've basically both sides of the conversation.
You know, it's interesting. I want to pick up on that point that you mentioned about people talking the talk and walking the walk. And certainly on a global stage, people were shocked around the world because Justin Trudeau globally had a reputation of being opening, you know, the image of him embracing refugees coming to Canada was the image that had sort of that lasting impression in an international sphere. So I wanted to ask you in terms of media coverage.
Yes.
Has media, Canadian, internationally, whatever we want to digest here, you know, digital especially also, has it done a good job, a responsible job of addressing the issues of race during the course of the election campaign?
I think that's a great question, and I think we could, although I have definitely seen improvements in the last little while, because this conversation, I mean, brownface and blackface, that incident was a flashpoint for this, and I actually think hopefully in the future, as Canadians, as a country, we'll look back on this moment and think of it as the moment where we've actually confronted the reality of the situation in terms of the reality of race and discrimination in this country. So I do think but I do think the media has a long way to go. I do think media and political institutions should be leading this conversation. And I think a lot of the coverage that we saw initially when the news first broke was super reductive. There was no kind of context for brownface and blackface because we didn't have ongoing nuanced coverage of racial issues in this country. So all of a sudden you get this big news and there's no context for Canadians to really understand or comprehend the issues. And really this issue points to a lot of underlying systemic racism that still exists in the country. So I think the kind of coverage that we want gets at the systemic underlying issues, not just the surface level outrage issues.
Now, we talked a little bit about the blackface. We've touched on that. That's not the only race issue that has come up during the course of this election. Certainly, the People's Party of Canada has somewhat made race an issue when we're talking about anti-immigration.
Absolutely.
And also, there are a lot of questions surrounding the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh. There were questions when he was you know, in a conversation with someone in Quebec who said, "Be a Roman in Rome,"
Yes.
while he was wearing his turban. And that is a province, certainly, where we know that there are rules that have been put into place which don't allow religious symbols. And it's something that was also has been targeted along the campaign trail.
Yes.
So I'm wondering whether or not someone who is a visible minority needs to harness that more within the campaign trail, or is it unfair to put that burden on their shoulders if we are such an open and inclusive society as we claim to be?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit it right on, because I actually would love to see a media analysis of how establishment media, especially in this country, has treated, you know, somebody who's a racialized person like Jagmeet Singh running to be leader of this country versus all of his competitors. Because the question often with Jagmeet Singh is, you know, there's discussion about whether he is a viable leader given the fact that he's wearing a turban. But the question for Justin Trudeau is he a viable leader given that he donned brownface? And that seems like a very unequal kind of assessment. It seems a little, you know, unfair that the standards are very different for the two leaders, and that's something that we need to have a little bit self-criticism and a little bit of self-reflection on as media makers, and also as the public, really.
And perhaps there will be much more analysis of this once we also get the election results as we count down to that day. But I wanted to ask you, looking forward now, so come the next policy issues, the next election, do you think there will be a more fulsome discussion surrounding race and diversity issues within this country? Do you think perhaps this election has opened the door to that kind of talk?
Yeah, I truly hope so. And I feel like if we navigate this properly, like I said, I think we're going to look back on this moment as a historic moment for this country. And I see this as really exciting, because for the first time, I feel like we're talking about race issues in a way that really speaks to the reality of what a lot of communities of color are experiencing on the ground. And so I really do, I'm optimistic, and I'm an optimist at heart, and I really do hope that future elections will be able to grapple with race in a much more nuanced way. So this is the start, really, of a new conversation that we're having in this country.
All right. Well, we'll have to see how it goes forward from here, but we really appreciate your time today, Anita.
Yeah, thank you so much.